Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Measuring Success Right. I'm your host, Tim Kelleher. Today's guest is Professor Ryan Pratt. Professor Ryan Pratt graduated summa cum laude from the University of Utah in 2004 with his bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science. After working for several years as a software engineer, he began the finance Ph.D. program at Duke University. After finishing his Ph.D. in 2012, Professor Pratt began teaching as a finance professor at the BYU Marriott School of Business. In 2021, he became an associate professor at BYU. Professor Pratt has 4 publications in the top 3 finance journals. He has an additional 2 working papers and 4 more in-progress papers. He has given over 50 invited paper presentations at conferences and universities across the nation. Professor Pratt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, very exciting. So I understand this semester you're teaching a new finance class. Can you explain to the audience what it is you're teaching?
Yeah, so it's new to me. It's not new overall, but I'm teaching the investments class in the Finance Junior Core, which I've previously been teaching corporate finance for quite a few years.
Okay, and how are you adjusting to the change? Has it been new?
It's new for sure, but that's something I was looking for. So I actually asked if I could switch over to this class when the opening came up. So I'm really happy to be in it.
Happy to be in it, and it's going well so far.
Yeah, it's going great.
Awesome.
Going great, yeah.
That's awesome. I would like to start out a little bit with your background. So you first graduated from the University of Utah in 2004, and you started as a software engineer. Mm-hmm. And can you just give the audience a little bit of background about what that entails and what you did?
Yeah, so I had a degree in computer science from the University of Utah, and started off using that degree working as a software engineer for a company called Applied Signal Technology. They're a sort of defense contractor. They were headquartered in Sunnyvale, California, but I was working out of their Salt Lake office. So we were in what's called the signals intelligence community, and that company, Applied Signal, has since been acquired by Raytheon quite a few years ago.
During that time, after working for the software engineering company, you switched to then getting a Ph.D. in finance at Duke.
Yeah.
Explain to us a little bit of the process between switching from software engineering to then going on to a Ph.D. in finance.
Yeah, I've had that question a lot from finance students, sort of how did you end up here? So for the way I think about it is that, for somebody who's 22 years old or thereabout, that it's really a high ask to say, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? You've really never tried working in a career before. So, I was kind of conscious of that I didn't know as an undergrad. I didn't have a lot of confidence that I knew what I wanted to do the rest of my life. So that meant I majored in computer science, which was really kind of a practical thing. I knew that I could earn a decent living. It was interesting to me. My dad was a software engineer. So all of those things sort of led me to computer science. And then honestly, I did math was a separate degree, and I did that just because I love math. So it was like I had one sort of practical degree and another degree that was because I liked it a lot. So what that meant was that never was it kind of in my mind that I was going to be a software engineer forever. It was like something I can do while I figure out what it is that I like to do. So I was working as a software engineer and just kind of always with my antennas up about, what is it that I really think I would like to do for work? Because you don't know what it's like to do the same thing every day, 8 to 5, 5 days a week, all year long, until you start doing that. So what happened to me was that I was earning more money than I needed as a software engineer, and I was young and I was single, and so I started trying to figure out what does a person do when he's earning more money than he needs, and that's basically finance. So I'm Googling on the internet. I'm at work and I'm supposed to be writing code, but I'm sneaking away reading stuff about finance on the internet. So I decided as long as what I want to do at work is read about finance, maybe I should learn about finance. And so that's kind of what led me to grad school.
I love that. That's so interesting. So would you say it was kind of your curiosity that led you into finance? Because before it sounds like you didn't have any training, or maybe you weren't even thinking of finance. So is it fair to say it was curiosity that got you there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just that, the things I was reading about when so you read about what do I do when I have some money, and it's all about investing, and that was very interesting to me. And I think in computer science, it's very technical. There's not a lot of sort of people aspect to it. Finance is still quite technical, but when you study finance, you're studying about people who transact in markets, and so sort of like interacting with humans, thinking about why humans do what they do is also a big part of it. And it was a little interesting. I was interested in moving sort of at least a little bit back toward some of those softer human skills.
Yeah, very interesting. I would say that's kind of what drew me to it too. Was there something specific about a Ph.D. program that attracted you to a Ph.D. program, or did you just set out with finance as your goal and landed in the Ph.D. program?
Yeah, well, I would say that at that point in my life, I don't think I understood very well, honestly, what would be the differences between an MBA, say, and a PhD in finance. Now, having done a PhD in finance, I understand those things to be just radically different things. An MBA is very much a practitioner-oriented degree, whereas if you get a PhD, the purpose of getting a PhD is to be able to do research in that field. So I think probably the best answer is that I ended up getting a PhD because I had done well in school and I liked school and I thought of myself as a person who would like to do grad school. And then I had a friend who was actually, he was an accounting PhD, and he helped orient me as to this is not just like an MBA plus, this is really a very different thing. And so I think initially I didn't really understand what it was I was getting into, but by the time I was filling out applications, I had a decent idea about it.
Understood more what a PhD was and what the purpose was after.
That's right.
So early on in the PhD program, did you already have your sights set on future research then?
No, I was, I think relative to most first-year PhD students, I was probably naive because of, I think a much more traditional approach to a finance PhD would have been studying a lot of economics in undergrad. Now, both my computer science and my math background have proved tremendously useful, but a lack of economics training was a liability. And so I spent a lot of the first year trying to learn economics because that's the foundation of finance. And if you don't understand economics well, you can't really do anything. So it's well before I was thinking about research, I was just sort of trying to develop the economic skills and intuition that are needed to do research in finance.
Okay, awesome. And I think that's a great lesson to go into a little bit deeper. When you find yourself in such a situation where maybe your background isn't quite as deep as you would want it to be, maybe you're lacking a little bit of knowledge, what advice would you give to people who are in that kind of situation at their first jobs, second jobs?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, what I would say is that I found in the PhD program that there's a lot of skills you need to be a successful finance professor. You need very good quantitative skills, both in terms of theoretical mathematics, also statistics. You need good economic skills. You need programming skills. All of those things are things you need to be successful in what I was trying to do. I didn't have all of them. The computer science was great because I can program. The math was great because I can do that. But the people, nobody had all of those skills. And so for me, I leaned on the skills I did have. There's this sort of 3-inch thick book by an author called Moscalel, Winston, and Green that's everybody that goes through a PhD program in economics, this is sort of your rite of passage is to go through this. It's extremely dense, very mathematical. And people that had econ training, as they read that book, what they were struggling with was the technical mathematics in that book. And I was struggling with sort of understanding the economic intuition in that book. So for me, it was useful to just lean on the skills that I did have, and then it was just there's no substitute for work in order to get the skills that you don't have.
Yeah, so play to your strengths and then make up the rest kind of as you're going.
Yeah, and it takes time, but I got it done.
Bit painful too, right?
Yeah, at times for sure.
So going off, you've mentioned a little bit about what you really liked about the PhD, but I also want to pose the question, is there anything else that you really enjoyed about your PhD?
I think, I introspect a lot, and I try to figure out, what it is that motivates me. And I think that's not a simple question. But one of the things that I've concluded over the years that is a fundamental motivator for me is learning. The opportunity to sort of expand the set of things that you understand and the tools that you have is fundamentally motivating to me. And so in the PhD program, I've never in my life been pushed so hard to think deeply, to form arguments that are strong and watertight. And so all of that treatment, and I was around very, very smart people. And so you're sort of, it's maybe a daily experience that you get in some friendly argument with somebody and you have to defend a position, and they're very smart and they have a position. And the training that I got doing that, I think I just really enjoyed it.
You enjoyed it. It was kind of it's fair to say that it was your passion. It still is your passion.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I'm always I'm a little bit, students that have had me know that that's not my favorite word to describe this, but yeah, it's something that I enjoy, and something that I don't have to get sort of motivated to do that. It's something that I'll enjoy doing.
Okay. Following your PhD, you come directly to BYU,
yeah,
correct?
That's right.
And would you say arriving here was a bit of a change for you coming out of your PhD program, or did you feel like you kind of fit in pretty quickly?
There's a lot of dimensions to BYU. So, starting off as an assistant professor anywhere was going to be a change. When you're in a PhD program, many places you're not allowed to teach. So at Duke, they don't allow PhD students to teach. You can be an assistant to a teacher. So now all of a sudden, instead of only being responsible to do research, which is what the last few years of the PhD program were, now I've got to teach. So that, going anywhere I would have experienced that. I was raised in Salt Lake, so I was pretty familiar with living in a community that's got a lot of members of the church. BYU is still quite different. I'd never been at BYU as a student, and I'd been in the professional environment. I'd been at other universities, and so it was a little bit getting used to the way BYU operates in terms of mixing religion and what you're doing in terms of your professional pursuits.
Yeah, a little bit different. So now you've been at BYU for 10 years, keeping it fresh by changing classes.
Yeah.
And what would you say throughout your research here has really been your favorite part?
So I would go back to what I said earlier, the opportunity to learn. So on a research project, I don't think I comprehended before, actually, even during the PhD program, before I had published papers, how many unpleasant steps there are in publishing a paper. So it's probably on average from the time you have an idea till the paper's published, it's probably 5 years. And so you have an idea, and then you have to think about, okay, how could I show this in data, for example? And then you have to acquire data, and then you have to code up some statistical tests, and those tests need to be able to make an argument as to why you're showing some economic force going on in the world. And then you submit the paper to conferences, and then you submit it to journals. And journals, the best journals have acceptance rates of sort of single digits, maybe around 5%. And so most likely you're going to get rejected. And if you don't get rejected, you're going to get a long, long to-do list that's going to take you months to do from referees. And so, there's a lot of what I just described that can be very tedious. But what's the payoff? The payoff is that you actually get to learn something, and then help other people to learn something. The best research is going to teach us something about the world that literally nobody knew before. And there's a lot of things we could learn about the world that nobody knew before, but if it's really good research, it's going to be important stuff that nobody knew about the world. And that's one of the things I think is a fundamental motivator for me.
Yeah, it's literally the creation of new knowledge.
That's right.
Right? Which I think is super exciting, super innovative.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give to students seeking to do research, or how do you get into research?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, I think, because often the students who come and ask that kind of question to me, most of the time they're students who are doing very well in their schoolwork. And one of the things that I experience, and I know this is almost a universal experience in grad school, is that the kinds of skills that help you be successful, say in an undergraduate program, are very, very different from the skills that help you be successful in research. So like if you can do the assignments that you're asked to do and do them well, and you like memorize things well, and you're calm during tests and things like that, you're going to do very well as an undergrad. And then when you're doing research, it's like all of a sudden somebody tells you, now you have to be creative. You have to have an idea that nobody had before and figure out a way to show that. And so you go home at night and you say, okay, I'm ready now. Idea, come. And it doesn't come. And you say, no, okay, now come. And you'll find that ultimately it's a very, very different skill set. So I would say, I know about finance, not about a lot of other disciplines. I would say to do finance research, first you have to have a set of skills that I've described, at least at a basic level. And then I think you need to start to understand the conversation. I don't think I started to learn what questions were interesting to people until I'd been going to seminars and reading papers in journals and going to conferences. And then you start to get a lay of the land. And it kind of, if you just tell me have a good idea, it's like there's so many possible ideas, my brain just like doesn't do anything. But if you tell me, okay, here's kind of a constrained space in which you can operate, you understand what people are talking about and maybe where the boundaries of that conversation are and how you could push that conversation a little bit further. That's what sort of enabled me to kind of orient myself and understand how I could contribute in finance research.
Yeah, it's almost as if, and correct me if I'm wrong, giving yourself limits and then thinking within those limits helps you create an idea within that space. Whereas when you don't limit yourself to anything, that it's almost overwhelming.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to pivot. Doing research and teaching, I imagine it's extremely busy. How would you say you balance your work and research responsibilities with other responsibilities like your family, religion?
Yeah. The thing that I've done that I think has been the most important on that is that I made decisions a long time ago about what compromises I was willing to make and what compromises I wasn't willing to make for professional success. And there are things that I haven't achieved in my professional career that I thought I might or hoped I would at least. But I'm not willing to do, in some cases, the things that it would take to accomplish those things. So, I have 3 little boys and I have a wife and I have a lot of responsibilities that matter to me a lot outside of my professional life. And, the reason I think that's an important thing is that the kinds of feedback you get in professional success is quick, right? You get a promotion, you get a raise, you get a paper accepted to a journal, and it feels good, and you're being told that you're doing good things. And the kind of feedback you get from investments in, say, a family, I think are much longer term. So a lot of times, if I'm being honest, there are days when my kids don't seem to like me, and that's not encouraging feedback. And so you have to sort of believe that like these investments are worth it, that these investments pay off in the long term, and that to me is a matter of faith. But I made decisions about what I was willing to do and what I wasn't willing to do a long time ago. And that helps me accept that whatever outcomes happen in my professional life are okay with. I'm okay with.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's awesome advice. When would you say that you made those decisions about what you were willing to negotiate and what you were not willing to compromise on?
I think when I went to grad school, that was the most intense time. I was working a lot and didn't have a lot of free time. And at that point, I was married and I didn't have children at that time. And then I had a son come along. I think it was my 3rd year of grad school. And just sort of it makes you ask yourself questions about what matters to you and how much you're willing to pay for your ambitions. I was ambitious and I like to do professional pursuits. But I think about that time, I had to figure out, okay, I would see people around me and people who had been successful in what I was trying to be successful in. And it wasn't always true that I wanted, to switch places with them, that they had made choices that I wasn't willing to make. And so seeing that and figuring out what it was I wanted was probably about the time I was in grad school.
About the time you were in grad school?
Yeah, like early in grad school, I'd say.
And was it just other people's examples that helped you determine what you weren't willing to negotiate, or was it personal experience, or what was the thing that really helped you decide?
I think it's more internal for me. So I'll give you one example. When I was in undergrad, I took school very seriously and I worked very hard in school. And I would do homework on Sundays and I was fine with that. Mm-hmm. And when I went to grad school, I decided I'm not going to do homework on Sundays. And I don't want to say that, like, all of your listeners have to decide that or not decide that. I'm okay with whatever individuals decide. But that was a choice I made, that I'm not going to, I felt like making that choice to do homework on Sundays in undergrad had let school really swamp the whole day of Sunday. And I decided I'm just going to I'm going to carve that day out, take it more seriously. And, I think it's, you could think of this, I think, as a spiritual blessing, or you could think of it as like human nature. And I think it doesn't have to be one or the other. But what happens on Friday when and you're committed to, I'm not going to do this work on Sunday, is that you work harder on Friday. And when Friday night comes and you might have watched a movie or something, you work. And what happens on Saturday is that when you might have gone out and played with friends, you work because you are committed to, I'm not going to do this tomorrow, so it has to get done today. And I saw that I could do in 6 days what other people were doing in 7 days. And Sunday was, for me at that point, more than it ever had been in my life, an actual day of rest. I looked forward to it because I was working so much 6 days that, like, taking this day off was great. And so I was doing something that, like, I've been taught to do that in my life, and I hadn't done it as well to that point. And I did it, and it felt like the right thing to do. So that's one example of, like, internally I had sort of felt like, I'm not really comfortable with the choices I made on this dimension as an undergrad. Let me try something different here in grad school because I'm going to be here for a few years, and I'm not sure I'm willing to not take Sundays as seriously as I did in undergrad.
Yeah, interesting. I really like that example. I think that's great for students to hear. Not even that it's something they need to necessarily do in their own lives, but it's a good example of the way that we should be thinking. Another question related to that is, what advice would you give to students who are just graduating now?
Yeah, so I feel like depending on the day of the week you catch me, this could be different things. There's lots of things, of course, and what's on my mind might differ from day to day. But one of the things I've said to students over the years is that, when you're 24 or whatever you are when you're graduating from college, you've had a really strong structure that has pushed you to develop intellectually, socially, for as long as you can remember, as long as you've been alive. And then you're going to emerge and you're going to go into the professional world or do other things. And there's not you don't have the schoolwork that's going to make you smarter over time, and you don't have maybe the same social connections. You go out and you maybe make new friends in some new place that you move or whatever you do. The thing that I would say is that what you are when you're 45 years old, or choose an age, 20 years, 30 years down the road, is not yet determined. I had a friend who once told me what he liked so much about his job was he didn't have to think. And that's like the opposite of me. What I like so much about my job is I get to think all the time. And it keeps me sharp. And in fact, I think it makes me sharper in a lot of ways. And so, if you compound 20 years of spending all your time thinking at work versus 20 years of that you don't have to think, I think these paths diverge tremendously. And so I would say that being thoughtful about continuing to develop, and it doesn't have to be intellectually, it can be in all kinds of ways, but my wife here is to me a tremendous example. She is what some people maybe a long time ago who aren't progressive enough might have said just a mom, but she has a master's degree in engineering, and she had a career before we had kids, and she stays home with our kids since we had our second one, and she is constantly learning new stuff. So when something breaks at the house, she's fixed our washer and dryer, she's fixed our dishwasher, she's fixed our water heater, and no one ever taught her how to do that stuff. She figures out how to do that stuff. We were going to France a couple years ago, so she started learning French. She's like the world's greatest indexer. She's like arbitrates all disputes on name indexing for the church website. She's just found ways to fill her time and learn and progress, despite that she spends most of her time with little children and helping them grow. So that's one of the things I think is really, it makes her interesting to me, that she's, over the last 20 years, she's progressed so much because she's chosen to do things that help her to learn and to grow. And I think being mindful about spending the next 10, 20, 30 years and ultimately your whole life progressing is what I have often told students when they're graduating.
Setting yourself on a path for growth and being committed to learning and adapting.
Yeah, I mean, one of BYU's mission and aims is inculcating a love of lifelong learning, and I think I'm very much a proponent of that.
Our last question is, in your life, how do you measure success?
Right. So I might be a little bit unconventional, particularly for a business school professor, in that I'm not a huge fan of measurement. I think in my life, when I've worried about outcomes, I think measurement most of the time is about outcomes. So you want to achieve some goal. The trouble for me with that is that there's a lot of things that determine that outcome that I have no control over. So what has worked better for me is to focus as much as I can on inputs. And I know what I want to accomplish and what I need to do. And I have a mental model where I imagine myself, and I believe I will have a post-mortal interview with the Savior. And when I come up to some decision point in my life, when I need to think about what to do, there's a lot of pressures in this world, and there's plenty of pressures to do things that would make me more scared of that post-mortal interview. And I try to remember that as often as I can, that, okay, I think this is going to happen. I don't want to be afraid of that. So for me, I measure my life by having honest conversations with myself about how I think that interview would go, and trying to make decisions that make me comfortable with the fact that I think I'm going to have that interview. And that's mostly about the inputs. Whatever outputs happen will happen, but I focus a lot more on the choices I make and the things that I can control, and making sure that I can account for those things.
Thank you, Professor Pratt, for being with us today. It's been wonderful having you here.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening this week. Feel free to check out our other podcast episodes, and we will see you next week.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review, or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.